Inside a warm house today, the heater hums, the doors stay shut, and somehow the cold still gets in. Out on the Great Plains, cold worked differently. The wind didn't blow fast. It crawled along the ground. Snow didn't fall. It moved sideways, scraping the last bit of warmth off the skin. On nights like that, a fire pit faded in minutes. The flames slipped down to a thin red line on the frozen ground. No wood left, no crackling sound, only the cold, waiting. Old people used to say this was the real test, not the storm, the moment when the fire gives up. So how did they survive nights when even the flame couldn't stay awake? Out on the Great Plains, real cold didn't come from the sky. It came from the wind crawling low across the ground. No trees, no walls, nothing to break it. If you set your lodge in the wrong place, that ground wind cut straight through the hide and killed the fire in minutes. Old people used to say the wind was the first test, not the cold itself. That is why the Lakota and the Crow never camped on open ground. They looked for a shallow dip in the earth, just enough to drop the lodge out of the wind. They watched how the snow piled up after a storm. A natural berm of snow waist high or even knee high could block half the wind chill without burning a single piece of wood. It was simple survival logic. You stay warm because you understand the ground, not because you fight it. They always turned the lodge door away from the main wind. Not straight south, not straight east, just off the wind enough so the gusts slid past instead of punching through the entrance. Archaeologists found camp circles where every lodge pointed the same way, showing the whole camp read the wind like a map. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a clever hack. It was knowledge sharpened by winters that didn't forgive mistakes. Pick the wrong spot, and the fire faded before midnight. Pick the right one, and the lodge stayed calm even when the gusts outside sounded like tearing canvas. Warmth for them started long before the fire was lit. It started with the land, with the way the snow settled, with the small things the wind revealed if you knew how to look. And once the camp was placed right, they moved to the next challenge, controlling the wind inside the teepee itself. Inside, a blizzard smoke doesn't rise the way we expect. It twists, it drops. The wind pulls it sideways and drags the heat with it. For the old families, the storm didn't just test the fire, it tested the air itself. If the flaps were open the wrong way, the wind sucked the warmth straight out of the lodge. If they were shut too tight, the smoke settled low and burned the eyes before it even reached the vent. Real cold gives you no second chances. That is why the people treated those flaps like valves. Not decoration, not simple covers. Valves. Pieces of hide that controlled the wind inside the teepee as carefully as they controlled the wind outside. When the storm pressed hard against the canvas, they closed only half of the windward flap. Just half. Enough to break the gust, not enough to choke the lodge. Then they opened the downwind flap a little wider. That small difference created suction, pulling the smoke up and out, while trapping the warm air low where the family slept. You can still see this pattern in old plain sites. Archaeologists found smoke-darkened poles tilted in the same direction, proof of how they read the wind. This wasn't luck. This wasn't comfort. It was survival logic. A small flame could keep a teepee warm if the airflow was right. A large fire couldn't save anyone if the airflow was wrong. They always kept the lower space sealed tight. Warm air stayed low. Cold air floated high and moved out through the vent. It was a simple system, but a smart one. And once they controlled the wind and smoke, they turned to the next enemy, the frozen ground underneath them. Out on the plains, the cold didn't just come from the air. Most of it came from below. Frozen ground pulled the heat out of a body faster than any wind. They learned quickly that the earth could steal warmth quicker than any storm. A small fire couldn't fight that, not through a long night, not when the flames were weak and the wood was almost gone. So the people built the warmth from the ground up. 3 layers. Nothing fancy. Just smart tested work. First came willow. Thin branches woven tight, strong enough to lift a sleeper off the frozen soil. Archaeologists found these mats flattened under old lodge floors, proof of how common they were. The second layer was snow-pressed grass, or dry grass, gathered before winter hit. Light, but thick enough to trap air. Air is what keeps you warm, not the material itself. The last layer was buffalo hide. Heavy, dense, a barrier against the frozen ground, the same hide that once held the heat of a running animal. You can still see hide fragments in old wintering sites darkened by years of use. Put together, these 3 layers raise the contact temperature by 10 to 20 degrees, with no extra fire, with no extra wood, just logic. The kind you learn when your life depends on it. That is why they slept warm even when the fire died down. Warmth didn't come from the flames. It came from what was under their backs. The people always said you prepare the ground first. If the ground is right, everything else is easier. And once the floor held its heat, they added the next piece of the puzzle. Not bright heat, not flame, but the quiet, steady warmth hidden inside stone. On blizzard nights, the fire never lasted long. Not when the wind crawled under the lodge and the woodpile was almost gone. By midnight, the flames shrank into nothing but a dull red glow. Old survivors said that was the moment when real cold showed its teeth. They couldn't burn more wood. There wasn't any. So they turned to something else. Something that held heat without flame. Stone. River stone, smooth and dense, the kind that cracked under sudden heat. Archaeologists found piles of these stones in wintering sites across Wyoming and Montana, each one split by fireproof of how often they were used. The people heated the stones in the strongest part of the fire, not warm, hot. Hot enough to keep their core warm through a long night. When the stones reached their peak, they rolled them out of the fire pit. Then they wrapped them, sometimes with hide, sometimes with a thin layer of ash. Anything to slow the release of heat and keep the stone from burning the bedding. Then they slid the stones under the edge of the sleeping area or beside where the families lay. No flames, no smoke, just quiet, steady heat radiating upward for hours. A hidden fire, a belly of warmth under the frozen ground. This was heat you didn't see but could feel. Heat that stayed alive until dawn long after the last spark faded. They called it using something hot but not burning. A simple idea, but a powerful one. And when the stones cooled, they didn't waste them. The leftover ash from the fire became insulation, another layer to protect against the frozen earth waiting underneath. From stone to ash, nothing was thrown away. Everything was turned into warmth. When the fire finally sank into a quiet bed of embers, another enemy rose up from the ground. Frozen soil pulled heat out of a body inch by inch. They knew the earth could rob you faster than the wind ever could. And when the fire went out, the ground took its chance. The people learned something simple. Ash doesn't burn. Ash doesn't freeze. And unlike dirt, ash doesn't steal heat. Archaeologists found rings of ash around old sleeping areas from the 16th to 18th centuries. Not scattered, not random, placed on purpose. A sign that the people used ash as insulation long before anyone called it insulation. When the fire pit was still warm, they pushed the remaining ash outward, spreading a thin layer around the sleeping space. Just enough to cover the ground that had been heated by the fire. Then they added more ash directly under their bedding. Not thick, not deep. Just a light blanket to keep the warmth locked in and stop the frozen earth from pulling it down. Ash acted like a shield. It slowed. Heat loss kept the ground from freezing over again and bought the family more time through the night. No smoke, no flame, just a quiet layer doing quiet work. In their camps, ash was never treated as waste. It was part of the system. Heat came from fire, but it stayed because of ash. That was survival logic at its finest. And once the ash held the warmth in place, they moved to the next barrier. Not the ground, not the fire, but the wind outside the wind they shaped using snow itself. Out on the plains, there was no timber to break the wind. No trunks, no branches. Nothing but snow. And when the wind crawled low across the ground, it cut straight under the lodge and dragged the warmth out through the hide walls. To the old winter camps, the ground wind was the one that killed you first, so the people turned to the only material the plains gave them in winter: snow. Not for melting, for shaping. Archaeologists at Fort Peck and Knife River found long curved ridges frozen into the earth berm lines that matched the footprint of old teepees. Proof that families once built wind walls out of nothing but packed snow. They worked fast, with their hands, with bone shovels. They pulled snow into a low ridge, around 2/3 of the lodge. Not a full circle, just enough to break the wind before it reached the hide. Knee-high was enough, a small wall that forced the wind upward instead of driving it straight through camp. When the storm hit, the berm did its job. The wind lifted over the ridge and lost its bite before sliding past the teepee. Wind chill dropped sharply, sometimes by 1/3 or more. No wood burned, no fire needed, just snow used in the smartest way possible. To them, you didn't need to stop the wind from the sky. You needed to stop the wind from the ground. That was the wind that crawled, the wind that stole breath, the wind that slipped under the hide faster than you could feed a fire. And once the berm blocked the ground, when the rest became easier, the floor stayed warm, the stones stayed hot, the ash held its heat. All that was left now was the one thing every winter depended on: how they kept their breath warm through the night. When the fire burned low and the blizzard pushed hard against the hide walls, body heat became more valuable than wood. For them, warmth started with breath, not with flame. The danger wasn't just the cold air, it was losing the heat your own body made. Most clothes let that heat escape. Once it slips out, you don't get it back. So the people used something better. Buffalo hide, thick, heavy, still carrying the density of the animal it once belonged to. Archaeologists found these hides in Mandan wintering sites, unprocessed, untreated, kept just the way they held warmth in life. They wrapped the thick hide on the outside and kept the softer side close to the body. That created a vapor barrier, a layer that trapped the heat and stopped moisture from escaping. Moisture loss meant heat loss. And on storm nights, losing heat through breath or sweat was the fastest way to freeze. With the hide wrapped tight, a person could hold on to the warmth their body was already making. No extra fire needed, no extra fuel, just smart use of what they had. In their eyes, a thick coat wasn't the key. A coat that held breath was. That was the difference between shivering through the night and waking up warm. And when every person in the lodge kept their heat from leaking out, the whole family stayed alive through storms many wouldn't have survived alone. Out in a blizzard, the fire was never the whole story. It helped, yes, but it wasn't what kept families alive. Survival came from the quiet things. The ground they prepared, the wind they redirected, the breath they protected, and the natural materials they used without wasting a single piece. None of it was heavy. None of it was complicated. It was only heavy with experience passed down by people who learned the hard way what real cold could do. They didn't fight nature. They read it. They worked with it. They understood that warmth wasn't something you burned. It was something you managed, something you held on to inch by inch, choice by choice, long before the storm arrived. And that simple wisdom, the kind that weighs nothing, kept entire families alive through nights most of us wouldn't last an hour in. Inside the teepee, the fire sinks to a faint red line. No crackle, no flame, just a small glow holding on in the dark. But the lodge stays warm, not because the fire is strong, because everything else is already doing its job. The ground prepared hours ago, the floor layered tight, the ash holding its heat, the stones still warm under the bedding, the snow berm blocking the ground wind, the hide trapping every breath. When the fire sleeps, they don't fear the cold. They already built their warmth long before the storm arrived. That was the logic of the old families. Fire was only the last step, never the first. If you want more real survival knowledge, the kind that kept people alive through nights like this, stay close. And if you know another technique, share it. We learn together, and we stay warm together. Stay by the fire.